This is Ism. Season 1, The Origins of Socialism. Paris and the Making of Modern Revolution. Ideas meet power. Prologue. Solidarity's Promise. The date was September the 28th, 1864. The place, St. Martin's Hall in London. A tall, echoing amphitheater, usually reserved for public lectures or political rallies, but today filled with a different kind of crowd. Carpenters, cabinet makers, shoemakers, printers, and masons, all squeezed into the wooden pews, their Sunday coats patched at the elbows, their woolen caps in their laps. The smell of cigars and sawdust drifted through the hall. Men leaned over pews to greet old comrades. Others traded pamphlets or argued in half a dozen languages. At the front sat a delegation of English trade unionists. George Odger, shoemaker by trade, William Kremer, a carpenter, Benjamin Luckraft, an old chartist. Practical men hardened in strikes and the endless haggling for wages. Beside them, a small contingent of French workers, artisans like Henri Toland, a bronze engraver and follower of Proudhon. Months earlier, Toland and his comrades had sent messages of support to British strikers in the building trades. And this gathering was meant simply as a thank you, a gesture of international solidarity. The speeches that day were not high theory, nor were they fiery revolutionary manifestos. One by one, artisans stepped up to the lectern and spoke plainly about their lives. Low wages, long hours, the constant threat of unemployment. And again, a theme returned. The bosses are united across the borders, so why aren't we? Each time, the hall erupted in cheers. But still, the memory of recent failures hovered over the proceedings. Many in the room had lived through 1848. They remembered the barricades, the desperate hope for national liberation, the betrayals when middle-class allies turned on them, and the bitter aftermath of prisoner exile. The lesson for many was seared deep in their souls. Nations had failed them. The bourgeoisie could not be trusted. If freedom was to come, it would come not from the politicians, but from the working class itself. And in one of those pews sat a 46-year-old Karl Marx, bearded, watchful, and quiet. He did not speak that day, nor was he much known to the other delegates, invited at the last minute, and mostly because he was simply living in London. But soon enough, he would be chosen to draft the founding documents that would give this gathering a name, a direction, and a purpose. By the time the meeting broke up that evening, it was clear that something had happened. What had begun as a gesture of gratitude was already turning into something more. A committee was formed. Letters would be exchanged across borders. And out of this hall, crowded with artisans, exiles, and dreamers, the International Workingmen's Association was born. Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to Ism. This is What is Internationalism? The dream of a global working class. When it was founded in 1864, the International Workingmen's Association had only a few hundred members, mostly English trade unionists, French activists, and exiles from the revolutions of 1848. At the time, Europe was still living with those revolutions' failures. Rapid industrialization had transformed cities, empires were consolidating, and the new working class was beginning to organize across borders. Over the next 5 years, the association would grow rapidly and eventually claim hundreds of thousands of members across Europe and the United States. By the late 1860s, the First International would be a pluralistic body, a federation of nationalities and ideologies, from cautious reformers to revolutionary socialists, from trade unionists to anarchists. This First International would last barely a decade, but it left descendants everywhere, many of which are still with us today. From the social democratic parties of the Socialist International and the Progressive Alliance, to the Communist Internationals of the 20th century, to the anarcho-syndicalist IWA that still bears its name. Almost every branch of the socialist left, from social democracy and communism to anarchism and syndicalism, can trace its lineage in one way or another to that first gathering in St. Martin's Hall.
So, this story reminds us that from the beginning, socialism has always been an international project, one defined by coordination and solidarity across borders. And today, we're going to explore that enduring idea by asking, what is internationalism? Interlude: Liberty Without Borders. Montevideo, Uruguay, 1846. The sky over the bay was blood red as Anita Garibaldi stood on the ramparts of El Cerro. The salted wind off the Rio de la Plata stung her face. Below, Uribe's soldiers ringed the plains, their campfires flaring like a noose tightening around this small, lonely republic. She heard footsteps behind her, soft and steady. It was Giuseppe with his red shirt and leather poncho, eyes bright with that strange mix of tenderness and absolute resolve. He said nothing at first as they both looked out over the bay. Then, "Anita, it is time." She nodded. In the courtyard below, the volunteers gathered. Not just Italians, but French carpenters, Swiss sailors, Spanish exiles, and even a few British runaways who had jumped ship in the harbor. All of them dressed in those same slaughterhouse red shirts, now the color of their cause. Anita walked down the stone steps to join them. In the fading light, she felt the shock of it again. These people devoted to a land not their own, ready to die for strangers because liberty, not nationality, was the great cause. Giuseppe swung into the saddle, and the volunteers mounted up. The wind gusted hard, tasting of salt and gunpowder. And then, at last, the general spoke, the same way he always spoke before a fight. "Comrades, I offer you hardship, hunger, thirst, forced marches, battle, and death. Who accepts, let them follow me." The words drifted through the red shirts. They answered not with cheers, but with silent resolve. And then, as one, they nudged their horses forward, toward the plains, toward the enemy encamped below, toward a future where borders mattered less than liberty. In 1834, 12 years before the siege of Montevideo, Giuseppe Garibaldi had been sentenced to death in absentia after joining Mazzini's Young Italy and participating in a failed Republican uprising in the Piedmont of northern Italy. From then on, he lived as an eternal exile, a fugitive sailor in the Mediterranean cut off from his homeland. Garibaldi eventually made his way to Brazil, where he joined the Ragamuffin rebels in Rio Grande do Sul, fighting against the Brazilian Empire. In those battles, he first met Anita, the courageous horsewoman who would become his comrade and companion in war. And it was in Brazil that Garibaldi began to see national liberation not as an Italian question, but as a global struggle against domination. From Brazil, Anita and Giuseppe crossed to Uruguay, where they fought in the long defense of Montevideo, put under a years-long siege during the Guerra Grande. Here, Garibaldi formed his famous Red Shirts, a multinational legion of volunteers who fought not for pay or plunder, but for Republican liberty wherever it happened to call them. Then, when revolution finally broke out across Europe in 1848, Garibaldi returned to Italy with Anita and fought for the short-lived Roman Republic. But like elsewhere in Europe, the dream of 1848 in Rome was ultimately crushed, this time by French troops sent by Napoleon III, who marched in to restore papal rule by force. And Garibaldi was not alone. Throughout Europe in 1848, an entire generation of romantic republicans had risen up against old Europe, and many did so not only in the name of their own nations, but in solidarity with others. The revolutions of 1848 were among the first truly international social upheavals, an unprecedented wave of uprisings, strikes, and insurrections that crossed national borders in a matter of months. Even today, Europe has never again seen a revolutionary wave that touched so many nations so quickly. In Italy, France, Germany, Austria, Poland, Hungary, Denmark, Romania, and even parts of the Caribbean and South America, people rose up en masse to demand liberation and emancipation. Now, these movements were uneven and their outcomes shaped by local conditions. But 1848 revealed a world in which ideas could travel and inspire across borders as never before. carried by print, railways, and the growing networks of exiles and workers. As we saw in our last episode on Paris in 1848, many contemporaries came to see these revolutions as incomplete. Constitutions were granted and republics declared, yet social demands, universal education, labor reform, wealth redistribution, gender equality, went largely unfulfilled. And in many places, the new governments responded not with reform, but with violent repression of the workers, women, and activists who had fought to put them in power. After Rome fell in 1849, Garibaldi and his legion of volunteers were forced to flee, and Anita tragically died during their escape. Garibaldi would spend the next several years in exile in the Americas, living on Staten Island and even working in a candle factory, before finally returning to Italy in the mid-1850s. For the most part, the aftermath of 1848 was one of reaction and retreat. Activists like Garibaldi were scattered across the globe, driven into exile and immigrant life. Yet both the revolutions themselves and the shared experience of betrayal and exile would plant the seeds of a new idea: internationalism. 1848 is often remembered as the springtime of the peoples, or the springtime of nations. And indeed, one of the great animating impulses of those revolutions, especially in Central and Southern Europe, was the creation of unified nation-states out of the ashes of old empires. People rose up to sweep away the old world of privilege and despotism, to forge new nations where people were no longer the subjects of kings and emperors, but equal citizens, equal Germans, Italians, Frenchmen, and Poles. Now, nationalism is a vast and complicated force, one we'll return to in much more depth in later episodes. But for our purpose here, what matters is how its romantic and revolutionary forms shaped the birth of internationalism. As the hopes of 48 soured into betrayal and disillusionment, those left out of the new order, workers, women, radicals, ethnic and racial minorities, quickly lost faith in the ability of nationalism to bring about their collective liberation. Yet the ethos of romantic nationalism left an imprint on 19th century politics too deep to be left behind. Everyone, from conservative monarchists to revolutionary socialists, absorbed some element of nationalism after 1848. For the socialist left, whether reformist or revolutionary, one of those inheritances was, oddly enough, internationalism. On the one hand, many socialists began to lose faith in nationalism as a liberatory program, especially as it was absorbed into global imperialism and monarchist reaction later in the century. But at the same time, romantic nationalism, an ideology embodied most vividly by Giuseppe Garibaldi, always contained a certain international spirit. Garibaldi's famous Legion of Red Shirts fought not only for Italian unification, but in the independent struggles of South America, Poland, Greece, and even France. In the decades that followed, his image would then inspire international red shirt-style brigades that fought in the American Civil War, amongst the volunteers of the Spanish Civil War, and with the anti-fascist partisans of World War II. His brand of global volunteerism, liberty without borders, left a deep imprint on revolutionary culture on the left. To us today, this influence of nationalism might seem kind of contradictory. When we think of nationalism, we often picture the aggressive, jingoistic kind that helped plunge the world into 2 world wars. But in the 19th century, nationalism was largely a left-wing emancipatory program. The idea was that Germans, Italians, Poles, and Greeks had lived for centuries under the foreign rule of emperors and monarchs, and if they were simply allowed to rule themselves, freedom would naturally follow. That was the dream, at least. Because 19th century nationalism was seen as a romantic and emancipatory project, it inspired a generation of volunteers who traveled to faraway lands to fight for national independence. The British poet Lord Byron went to Greece in the 1820s to fight Ottoman rule. Garibaldi, alongside fighting for Italian unification, joined the Republican rebels in Brazil and Uruguay. Later in his life, he would volunteer again to defend France against the Prussian invasion of 1870. So, from the beginning, romantic nationalism carried an international current. Italians fighting for Brazilians, Frenchmen for Poles, Germans for Italians, and so on. The revolutions of 1848 were in many ways the high point of this kind of global romantic nationalism. Many who rose up that year saw themselves as part of a struggle that was both national, fighting for German or Italian independence, and international, fighting for the liberation of all peoples.
So, when the International Workingmen's Association, the First International, was founded in 1864, romantic nationalism still permeated the radical left. Garibaldi himself, who at that point was a near mythic figure on the left, openly expressed support for the organization, even if he never formally joined. Yet while the spirit of cross-border solidarity endured, many of the First International's early leaders saw their movement as a rejection of romantic nationalism. Formed by artisans, workers, and radical Republicans, the International carried an inherent distrust of the bourgeoisie, the class they believed had betrayed them in 1848. And so, now hardened by this betrayal, in place of national liberation came class liberation. And that is the central development of the First International. It was the first organization to attempt to represent an economic class across borders, the working class, the proletariat. This shift in focus was both self-conscious and contentious. In its early years, the International was divided over whether to support national liberation struggles in places like Poland, Italy, Ireland, and even Mexico. Some members, especially those influenced by Marx, saw these movements as progressive only when they weakened reactionary empires like Russia, Prussia, Austria, and France under Napoleon III, whose regimes had crushed democratic uprisings across the continent following 1848. Others, particularly the French mutualists who followed Proudhon, categorically dismissed nationalist struggles as bourgeois distractions. Over time, though, the center of gravity within the association would begin to move away from national questions and toward the conviction that the emancipation of the working class had to be the primary goal. At a General Congress in London in 1865, one delegate argued that the liberation of Poland would, quote, only benefit three classes: the high nobility, the low nobility, and the clergy. This somewhat cynical view of national independence reflected the lingering disillusionment of 1848 and increasingly defined the International stance in the years that followed. Now, this tension between socialism and nationalism would not disappear. It would return again and again, from the Paris Commune to the anti-colonial revolutions of the 20th century to the global movements of the 21st. But in the First International of the 1860s, something fundamentally new had been born, because internationalism now meant that the working class would no longer seek freedom through the nation, but over it. Between 1864 and 1868, the First International expanded steadily. Its strategy was simple: reach out to already existing workers' associations across Europe and North America and invite them to affiliate. For most local groups, there was little downside in joining, and the invitations were often met with enthusiasm. The nature of these affiliate groups varied widely, reflecting the political conditions of each country. In places where liberal reforms had opened up public space, Belgium, Switzerland, and England, sections operated openly as associations, unions, or early labor parties. In more repressive environments like Prussia, Austria, and France, the international sections functioned as clandestine cells, constantly at risk of surveillance and arrest. These contrasting conditions shaped each group's outlook and methods. Many of the early leaders and much of the General Council in London were British trade unionists, who focused on practical gains, strikes, wage negotiations, and the campaign for universal male suffrage. The French delegates, by contrast, were largely disciples of Joseph Pierre Proudhon, the early anarchist thinker who had declared that property is theft. Proudhon himself never joined the International, as he died just months after its founding. But his ideas cast a long shadow over its early years, as many of his followers became influential members. Living under Napoleon III's authoritarian Second Empire, his followers saw little hope in strikes or elections under a regime that fused capitalism and dictatorship. Instead, the French mutualists, as they were known, sought to bypass both the state and their bosses altogether. They envisioned a society built on small-scale cooperative exchange, networks of workers' associations, mutual aid societies, and credit unions that could sustain themselves independently of capitalists and governments. Proudhon's dream of a so-called People's Bank issuing interest-free credit was less a scheme of finance than a moral principle. The idea that economic relationships should rest on equality and reciprocity, not exploitation. Across Europe, the International thus came to encompass radically different worlds. English union halls, French cooperatives, Swiss worker federations, and underground clubs in Prussia and Austria. What united them was not a single program, but a shared conviction that the working class, wherever it lived, had to organize itself in solidarity. As the International grew, its diversity of goals and methods inevitably bred discord and factionalism. In the historiography of the First International, this conflict is often exaggerated, partly because everyone loves some good drama, and the feud between Marx and Bakunin was nothing if not full of petty squabbles and vicious backbiting. But before diving into that great schism, which we will dedicate an entire episode to at the end of this current arc, it's worth remembering that these factions agreed on much more than they disagreed. They were all committed to class struggle, all anti-capitalist, all striving toward a world of greater freedom and equality. Where the trouble lay was in how to get there. The core tensions that would later explode, especially in the aftermath of the Paris Commune, were already present in the 1860s. So let's lay them out briefly, knowing we'll revisit them again and again, because these arguments will not go away, and by the 20th century they'll become questions of life and death. As we touched upon in episode 1, one of the oldest and deepest divides on the left concerns the state. Do you use it to liberate the people or destroy it to liberate the people? Eventually, anarchism would come to be associated with the latter and Marxism with the former. But the early anarchists in the tradition of Proudhon were not violent insurrectionists. Their anarchism was philosophical, not militaristic, a belief that domination could be overcome not by storming the state, but by ignoring it entirely. Proudhon urged people to focus on building a new society within the shell of the old. Local cooperatives, credit unions, labor associations, and volunteer councils that could federate freely from below. In the wake of the French Revolution, which had promised liberty but delivered Jacobin centralization and dictatorship, this really was a radical new way of thinking. It changed the course of left-wing politics forever. Still, many others found this position naive or even impossible. For British trade unionists, the path to liberation ran straight through political participation, winning the vote, reforming the law, organizing openly. Ignoring the state made no sense when they were specifically fighting to gain access to it. For the German theorist, especially Karl Marx, Proudhon's position was worse than naive. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of how history, politics, and economics actually worked. Now, once again, we need to be careful not to overstate these divisions, especially around Marx. When you read his writing, he comes across as one saucy individual, constantly dunking on his intellectual rivals. His pages overflow with invectives and polemics. But in the early years of the International, Marx often played the role of mediator between the French mutualists and the English trade unionists. He tended to side with the unionists, supporting strikes, collective action, and political organization, but he rarely pressed his own theories too forcefully. Instead, he often tried his best to keep the coalition together. Yet, as the International grew and ideological rifts deepened, Marx did begin to speak with a sharper tongue. And by the Geneva Congress of 1866, he was already pushing back against the French delegates' proposals to ban strikes and oppose collective ownership. And over the next 2 years, at the Congresses in Lausanne and Brussels, he began to argue more openly that the working class could not simply build cooperatives. It had to wage class struggle, organize politically, and ultimately take collective control of economic production. Following the Brussels Congress of September 1868, 2 developments would set the tone for the International's next 5 years. First, Marx's coalition emerged triumphant. The Congress affirmed the need for collective ownership of land and the instruments of labor, and endorsed the use of strikes as a tool of class struggle. These resolutions marked a clear defeat for the French Proudhonists, whose influence within the International began to wane. But only a few months later, an even more consequential event took place. From his base in Geneva, the revolutionary anarchist Mikhail Bakunin applied to affiliate his newly formed Alliance of Socialist Democracy with the First International, a move that would transform and eventually fracture the entire organization. Mikhail Bakunin is one of the most fascinating figures you're bound to encounter. Like Marx, he began his life as a scholar before his radical ideas ended any hope of an academic career. In the 1840s, Bakunin, Marx, and Proudhon actually all moved in the same small circle of Parisian radicals, debating philosophy and politics in cafes and salons. But then the revolutions of 1848 would scatter them in radically different directions. Proudhon stayed in Paris, working as an agitator and pamphleteer. Marx, the theorist and journalist, bounced from Brussels to Paris to Cologne before ending up in London. Bakunin, ever the man of action, plunged into the revolutions themselves, first in the Prague Uprising of 1848, then in Dresden in 1849. Eventually captured by the authorities, he was sentenced to death, then handed over from one empire to another for years before finally being exiled to Siberia. But he would escape in 1861 and then make one of the great journeys of the 19th century. The passage took over a year. Riverboats down the Amur toward the Pacific, a Japanese interlude in Yokohama, a sickening Pacific crossing to San Francisco, and then the long way through Panama and New York before he finally crossed the Atlantic and returned to London in 1862. Bakunin often joked that he had survived Tsarist dungeons easily, but that his seasickness on the waves of the Pacific had brought him to his knees. A few years later, having lost none of his fervor after years of prison and exile, he tried to join the Polish uprising against Tsarist rule in 1863, the very struggle that had divided opinion within the International and which had even seen a contingent of volunteers led by Garibaldi and Anita's son. Bakunin, though, was arrested before reaching the front and was once again thrown in jail. In spirit, Bakunin had much more in common with Garibaldi than with Marx. He believed liberation was made in motion, not in theory. But by the mid-1860s, Bakunin would finally settle in Geneva, where he gathered a devoted circle of exiles from Russia, Poland, France, Spain, and Italy. Drawn by his charisma, revolutionary prestige, and clear program of collectivist anarchism, this circle soon coalesced into the Alliance of Socialist Democracy in 1868, whose stated aim was, quote, the political, economic, and social equalization of all classes and individuals of both sexes. The alliance grew quickly and sought to affiliate with the International, though its initial application was rejected for creating, quote, a group within a group. Its members were soon accepted as independent sections. So by the spring of 1869, Bakunin's movement was effectively a part of the International, and his arrival would ignite both its most dynamic period of growth and its fiercest internal conflict. In 1868, estimates put the International's membership around 150 to 200,000. By 1869, that figure had climbed to roughly 500,000, though this included affiliated trade unions rather than just individual dues-paying members. And by the spring of 1871, as the Paris Commune was being born, the International claimed close to 800,000 members across Europe and North America. These were rough estimates, and the true numbers were probably smaller, but the perception of rapid growth mattered. For radicals and workers, the idea of a vast border-crossing association of laborers was exhilarating. For the rulers and capitalists of Europe, it was terrifying. Much of this surge stemmed from Bakunin's entry, as his alliance expanded the International's reach into Spain, Italy, Switzerland, and the Jura region of eastern France. The momentum was further fueled by an economic downturn in 1869 and 1870, when rising prices and industrial slowdown triggered mass strikes in Belgium, France, and Britain. Within this charged atmosphere, even unaffiliated workers' organizations claimed membership in the International. Its very name had become a rallying cry, a symbol of collective strength that could inspire solidarity or scare employers into yielding to worker demands. So, by 1870, the word international carried enormous weight, invoked by artisans in London, strikers in Belgium, and radicals in the cafes of Madrid and Naples. For a moment, it seemed that the working class might truly unite across borders. But ultimately, the organization would expand faster than anyone could control. Bakunin's arrival had electrified the movement, yet this very success exposed the fault lines that would soon tear it apart. This unraveling would greatly accelerate in 1871 after the people of Paris, amidst the catastrophe of siege and starvation, launched a revolution and established the world's first workers' government. Now, our next 2 narrative episodes will cover that story in depth as we trace the birth and death of the Paris Commune. But it was there, on the barricades of 1871, that the tensions we've been tracing came violently to the surface. Both Marx and Bakunin would claim the Commune as vindication of their own vision, and in the aftermath, the International itself would begin to fracture. Before we get there, though, I want to sketch the outlines of this growing divide between Marx and Bakunin, and then end with the strike movements of 1870, where the International was involved in on-the-ground organizing. These final moments before the Commune reveal both the promise and the peril of international solidarity on the eve of its greatest test. A major turning point came at the Basel Congress of 1869, held in Switzerland, the first that Mikhail Bakunin attended in person. His charisma, network, and sheer force of personality were immediately felt. Yet in a twist that might surprise us, the Congress actually saw Marx's followers and Bakunin's in rare agreement. Both joined forces against the French mutualists, the followers of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Now, you might be thinking, wait, wasn't Bakunin an anarchist? And weren't the mutualists also in the anarchist tradition? And, well, that's true, but their division is also the key to understanding why Bakunin's brand of anarchism was so distinct and compelling for a lot of people. The Proudhonists distrusted all forms of coercion, centralization, or violence. They opposed strikes and rejected collective ownership, seeing both as threats to individual freedom. Bakunin shared their hatred of authority, but not their quietism. He argued that liberation required collective action and collective ownership, that workers had to take control of the means of production together. In this, he aligned closely with Marx, who likewise saw collective ownership as the foundation of any real emancipation. Both men, in other words, were collectivists. Now, collectivism wasn't so much a strict doctrine as a moral and social outlook. The belief that the well-being of the group must take precedence over the individual. In practice, it meant common ownership of land, factories, and the tools of labor. Each worker or peasant an equal participant in both production and decision-making. In short, Proudhon's followers privileged individual exchange and small-scale cooperatives. Marx and Bakunin envisioned an entirely new social order built on collective control. The Basel Congress ended with a decisive victory for this collectivist tendency, thanks in part to Bakunin's influence and also to the Belgian delegation, led by César de Pape, shifting their support away from the French mutualists. So the International now formally endorsed the collective ownership of land and labor. For the mutualists, it was a defeat, though many of them would carry their ideas into the Paris Commune just 2 years later. And as we'll see, commune leaders like Eugène Varlin will attempt to reconcile mutualist and collectivist ideals within the hard realities of revolution and civil war. With the mutualists sidelined, the real tension could now emerge between Marx and Bakunin themselves. The difference was not in their goal, but in the means. Both wanted to abolish exploitation and domination. Both believed in collective ownership. Where they diverged was over the question of the state. For Bakunin, the state was irredeemable. Even a workers' state, he warned, would simply reproduce hierarchy under a new name. To seize power was to become corrupted by it. Marx saw this view as naive and utopian. Power, he argued, was not a moral question, but a material one. The working class had to seize the state, dismantle the machinery of the old order, and use it to build the new. Without power, there could be no transformation, only rhetoric. That argument, whether to seize the state or abolish it, would soon become the defining fracture of the socialist movement, a fracture that in many ways still haunts the left to this day. And in spring 1869, this theoretical dispute would collide with brutal reality in the coal fields of Belgium. Interlude: The Belgian Massacres, April 1869. The dawn over the Borinage came gray and heavy with coal dust. Outside the pithead at Marchion-au-Pont, the miners stood silent in their threadbare coats, eyes stinging from sleepless nights. They had been off the job for days, hungry but unbent, waiting for word, perhaps food or medicine from the comrades abroad who had promised help. The strike was holding, but only just. When movement came at last, it was not a messenger, but a column of soldiers. The men hesitated. They had prepared for a manager, not a corporal. After a tense exchange, the officer turned in frustration. Then the miners began to sing, a hoarse, uneven chorus that carried down the slag heaps. The officer yelled an order that no one could quite make out. A young conscript's rifle cracked and the line erupted. In seconds, the yard was filled with smoke and screaming. 5 lay dead, dozens wounded, the rest scattering through the fields. In Brussels, César de Pape read the telegram with shaking hands. A physician by training, he had seen bodies broken by the mines. But this was different. Labor gunned down simply for demanding a living wage, for daring to stop work. He rushed to the telegraph office to alert Marx in London. The government has answered hunger with bullets. The bourgeois state, even in its liberal form, cannot coexist with the emancipation of labor. Then, leaning over the counter, he sent one more line to the miners' committee. Hold fast, Europe stands with you. For a brief moment that spring, as workers across the continent sent money and proclaimed their shared outrage, it felt as if solidarity was finally alive. By 1869 and 1870, amidst a wave of economic downturns, the International was finally given the chance to put its principles of solidarity into practice on a mass scale. After years of network building and debate, it now faced the test of a real struggle. In Switzerland, construction workers launched a strike for higher pay and shorter hours. Bakunin and his circle helped organize mutual aid and coordinate between local groups, while Marx and his allies in London sent funds and propaganda. The strike ended inconclusively, but it offered proof that cross-border organization was possible, and it dramatically expanded the International's membership in Geneva, amplifying Bakunin's growing influence. Then, in Belgium, coal miners and iron workers walked off the job in one of the largest labor actions of the decade. César de Pape, leader of the Brussels branch of the International, coordinated support from Britain, Switzerland, and France. When soldiers opened fire on the strikers, killing several and arresting hundreds, the International condemned the violence and rallied funds across Europe. It was the first time an international working-class body had responded collectively to repression. The defiant legacy of these strikes would echo through time. A generation later, in 1893, the Belgian General Strike, often described as Europe's first truly general strike, would begin in these same mines of the Borinage, carried by descendants of the very workers shot down in 1869. Over the following year, the unrest would spread throughout Europe, from the bronze foundries of Paris to the dockyards of London. And for the first time, the International was in a position to act as something more than a debating society. When Belgian miners went on strike, English and Swiss unions sent money. When Paris metal workers were arrested, Belgian and British unions supported their families. The International was essential in coordinating these efforts. The strikes of 1869 to 70 rarely ended in outright victory. Most were crushed by soldiers or undermined by scabs. But as workers donated funds and coordinated mutual aid across national borders, it seemed that the idea of international solidarity was no longer just an aspiration. It was now a living practice. Yet the year 1870 would not be remembered for these strikes, but instead for one of the most consequential conflicts of the 19th century. The Franco-Prussian War would bring an end to the Second French Empire and give birth to the German Empire. France's defeat marked a national humiliation, while the rise of Bismarck's Germany shifted the balance of power in Europe, setting in motion the rivalries that would eventually lead to 2 world wars. But in Paris, the war brought something else. Out of deprivation and siege came a revolution that would forever change the socialist imagination. The Paris Commune, born of hunger, betrayal, and hope, would be remembered by conservatives as a nightmare and by workers, radicals, and women as a glimpse of emancipation.
Though rooted in the streets of Paris, it spoke a universal language. Its leaders, Louis Michel, Charles Delacluse, Eugène Varlin, and others, saw themselves as part of a global struggle to free humanity from domination. In other words, the Commune was self-consciously international, its message echoing far beyond France, from the factories of Chicago to the barricades of Petrograd to the streets of Beijing. So, join me for our next 2 narrative episodes as we enter 1871 and witness the birth and death of the Paris Commune.
Du bon sur les mous, sans goutte de sang, mais je l'ai bien cool, les dents de série. Ism is written and produced by me, Matt Payne. The original musical score is composed by Ian Payne. Our theme song is performed by Aloe Vera on vocals and banjo, with accompaniment from Ian and myself. If you're curious how I build these narrative scenes, where I source the quotes, what lines are verbatim, altered, or composed to capture the essence of a moment, you'll find full transcripts, suggested readings, show notes, and behind-the-scenes looks at my process on the Ism Substack. The link is in the episode description. To learn more about Ian's work, you'll also find his website there. And if you'd like to reach out, you can email me at ismhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next time.